Let's just start off with try and get a shared understanding of how we've got into this mess. And it's interesting that, I don't know whether you saw some of Brown's speeches recently, he actually started condemning the Washington Consensus, which is a bit bizarre because we always thought that he was part of that Washington Consensus. It's interesting how thinking's moved on. And our analysis, and we developed it last year, and LEAP put out its papers in the years before that, is basically saying, well, it's blindingly obvious what happened. There was a development of a toxic mix of policies, all of which contributed to this crisis and coalesced to develop this latest crisis of capitalism. And you can come in at this at any policy area if you like, but if you start off with Graham Turner's prime analysis, which is that you start off with undermining trade union rights, so that if you undermine trade union rights, you suppress people's ability to organise to maintain their standard of living and enhance their standard of living. So as a result of that, you suppress wages. Simple as that. Then you introduce a policy of privatisation. There's no sequential order. Most of this was a part of the Washington Consensus here and in the States and imposed upon the globe as well, as a mix of policies. You introduce privatisation, outsourcing and offshoring, and as a result of that, if you haven't got trade union rights to defend yourself, your job becomes privatised, and that results in, again, reduction of wages and conditions. What then happens is that you overload that with a taxation system, which means that the rich, well, in terms of wages, if you go back to wages, what is it? The executives on the FTSE 100, their wages have gone up 7 times the rate of the average worker. And does the taxation system compensate for that? No, it doesn't. We get to a situation where you have such an unfair taxation system, the richest are paying, well, the poorest are paying proportionately more than the richest, and the richest are paying, well, we saw some of the examples amongst the bankers in particular, paying less tax than their own cleaners proportionately for their incomes. Again, it's all part of suppressing of wages. And it creates, and Richard Wilkinson will go into it in later detail this afternoon, it creates one of the most unequal societies that we've had in our history, and that has the consequences of antisocial behaviour, increased levels of crime, breakdown of social cohesion, and even a withdrawal from the political process as well, and the engagement within community. But so if you're undermining trade union rights, you're cutting wages, you're privatising jobs to undermine conditions and wages, and you're offshoring, you're outsourcing them. You're not addressing the situation by the taxation system, in fact you're making it worse. You're creating an unequal society. Well, there's one thing that no matter what your wages are, you've got to try and afford, and that's a roof over your head. So if you then introduce a policy where you starve social housing, you prevent councils building homes again, you then create a crisis in housing where people can't get a roof over their heads in their what used to be the normal route for 60% of the population, which was to go to council housing or social housing. So what do you then do? Well, the only thing that you can do, you borrow money to try and get a roof over your head. Because what's happened is housing supply has literally dried up in the public sector. The private sector is trying to maximise its profits and therefore actually slows down the supply of housing to maximise the profits that they're making. So you, on your lower wages, are having to afford higher priced accommodation because you can't get council accommodation. So what do? You borrow. You have to borrow. You go out and you scramble every way you possibly can. You're promoted in the media that this is a good investment anyway. You scramble around and you borrow whatever you can to get a roof over your head amidst the housing, amidst housing prices going through literally through the roof. And at the same time, what the government then does is it deregulates the finance sector, so there's no controls over lending or borrowing, and so here you have a deregulated finance sector waiting to capture those vulnerable people who are desperate for a roof over their heads and are willing to pay whatever it takes to house their families. You can see that this is blindingly obvious, isn't it, to anyone apart from in a new Labour cabinet, isn't it? So, the consequences of this toxic mix of policies all results in what? A debt bubble building up that will eventually, inevitably burst because the assets and the wages can't support that level of debt. It's just blindingly, bleeding obvious. That's what happens.